They had time to turn back. The sea was calm. The horizon was clear. Radio reports had already hinted at danger ahead, enemy forces moving, air power gathering, routes no longer secure. Every signal pointed to the same conclusion. This mission no longer made sense. And yet, the ship kept sailing. Its engines maintained speed, course unchanged, orders repeated without discussion. On the bridge, officers studied charts they already knew by heart, fully aware that every mile forward narrowed their options. Turning back was still possible, stopping was still possible, but stopping was not what they had been trained to do. In the final year of the Pacific War, Japanese warships often sailed not because success was likely, but because retreat carried its own consequences. Doctrine, honor, and expectation weighed heavily, sometimes more heavily than fuel shortages or enemy aircraft. Ships were sent out even when air cover was thin. Crews were ordered forward even when intelligence was incomplete. The system rewarded obedience, not survival. This voyage began like many others. Routine checks, quiet decks, sailors going about their duties with practiced efficiency. Below decks, engines throbbed steadily. Above, the ocean stretched wide and indifferent, giving no sign of what waited ahead. Some crew members sensed it anyway. Veterans noticed the details, the lack of friendly air patrols, the unusual silence on certain frequencies, the way the ship felt exposed despite its size and firepower. A few exchanged glances. No one spoke openly. Questions were rarely asked this late in the war. Because questions changed nothing. The ship had been built for battle. Its steel hull, heavy guns, and layered compartments represented years of naval thinking, an era when power at sea was measured in tonnage and armor. It was designed to absorb punishment, to fight through damage, to keep moving even when wounded. What it was not designed for was a war that no longer followed those rules. As the hours passed, the distance to safety shrank behind them. With every mile forward, the option to turn back became less practical. Not because it disappeared, but because choosing it would require admitting what everyone already knew, that the balance had shifted, that the old assumptions no longer held, that survival now depended on avoiding battle, not seeking it. Still, the ship pressed on. Orders arrived, signals acknowledged, course confirmed. On paper, everything remained normal. But beneath that surface calm was a growing tension, a sense that the voyage itself had become the risk. The crew did not know the exact moment when fate would close in. They only knew that when it did, it would come fast. Modern war allowed little time for adjustment, no warning shots, no gradual escalation, just sudden violence. And when that moment arrived, there would be no space left to reconsider the choice that had already been made hours earlier, when they had time to turn back and didn't. By mid-morning, the warnings were no longer subtle. Radio traffic grew erratic, short bursts, clipped acknowledgments, long stretches of silence where there should have been routine updates. Reports from other units were delayed or missing entirely. Somewhere beyond the horizon, forces were moving that the crew could not see but could now feel. The ship's lookouts scanned the sky more often than before. At first there was nothing, just clouds drifting slowly, sunlight glinting off a deceptively calm sea. But absence itself had become suspicious. In earlier years of the war, Japanese air patrols would have been visible, reassuring, omnipresent. Now the sky felt empty in a way that suggested not safety, but abandonment. Below decks, the atmosphere changed. Damage control teams were quietly placed on higher readiness. Ammunition was checked and rechecked. Watertight doors were inspected, not because orders demanded it, but because seasoned sailors understood patterns. They had seen this before. Other ships sailing forward into uncertainty, trusting that speed, discipline, and tradition would somehow compensate for a battlefield that no longer played by familiar rules. On the bridge, officers spoke in measured tones. They discussed headings, weather, fuel consumption, nothing about fear, nothing about retreat. To do so would have been pointless. The mission still existed. Until it was officially canceled, it would be executed. This was how navies functioned, not through dramatic decisions, but through momentum. Each passing hour made turning back more complicated. Fuel calculations shifted, schedules tightened. The window for a clean withdrawal narrowed, not tactically, but psychologically. The longer they sailed on, the harder it became to justify reversing course. Because if they turned back now, the question would be unavoidable. Why didn't you turn back earlier? The crew felt it too. Some wrote brief notes in personal notebooks, mundane observations, small thoughts, nothing that resembled a farewell. Others focused intensely on routine tasks, cleaning equipment that was already clean, checking valves that were already secure. These habits weren't about preparedness, they were about control. Control was becoming scarce. Then came the first undeniable sign. A distant sound, low, almost indistinguishable from the wind at first. Not an explosion, not gunfire, just a vibration carried faintly through the air, easy to dismiss if you wanted to. Aircraft. The lookouts stiffened. Binoculars were raised. Reports came down to the bridge in careful language. Possible contacts, extreme range, bearing uncertain. No confirmation, no panic. Yet everyone understood what this meant. The ship had crossed an invisible line. From this point forward, events would no longer unfold at a pace chosen by those aboard. The initiative had shifted elsewhere, to forces that could strike without warning from directions that armor and guns were never meant to counter. Still, the engines held speed. No order to turn back was given, because by now, turning back would not guarantee safety, only delay. And delay in the final year of the war often changed nothing at all. The crew waited. They waited knowing that whatever came next would arrive suddenly, violently, and without room for debate. The decision to continue had already been made, not in a single moment, but gradually, through every mile sailed after the first warning appeared. When the attack finally came, there would be no time left to wonder whether they should have turned around. That question had already been answered. The first strike did not arrive with drama. There was no warning siren at first, no shouted command echoing across the deck, just a sudden change in the air, an unnatural stillness, followed by a sound that no one mistook for anything else. Aircraft engines. Close now. Fast. The lookout's report came almost simultaneously with the realization spreading through the ship. Contacts confirmed. Multiple. Altitude low. Direction unfavorable. The enemy had found them long before they had been seen. Orders snapped into motion. General quarters. Watertight doors sealed. Guns elevated. Men ran to stations they had trained for, rehearsed for, and quietly feared for years. Above deck, anti-aircraft crews swung their weapons skyward. Below, engineers braced as engines strained to maintain speed. The ship did what it had been built to do: respond instantly, efficiently, without hesitation. The first explosions were not hits. They were near misses. Bombs and torpedoes striking the water close enough to lift the hull, close enough to remind everyone aboard how thin the margin had become. The ship shuddered, steel groaning as pressure waves rolled beneath it. Then came the hit. A sharp, concussive blow, not loud at first, but heavy, different from the others. The kind of impact that traveled through the structure, felt in the chest before it was heard. Somewhere below the waterline, something essential had been breached. Reports flooded in. Flooding in multiple compartments, power fluctuations, smoke rising where it shouldn't. Damage control teams moved instantly, sealing sections, fighting water with pumps that strained under growing pressure. Training took over. Fear was pushed aside by procedure. For the moment, the ship was still alive. But the attacks did not stop. More aircraft followed,
attacking in waves. The sky above the ship became chaotic. Tracer fire climbing upward, explosions tearing open clouds, aircraft diving low and fast, releasing their weapons at distances too close for comfort. The ship's guns fired continuously now. The noise was overwhelming. Steel casings clattered across decks. Smoke thickened, stinging eyes and burning lungs. Orders were shouted, repeated, misunderstood, shouted again. Somewhere amid the chaos, men fell. Some wounded, some killed instantly, often without anyone noticing at first. Still, the ship fought on. That was the cruelest part. Despite damage, despite casualties, despite fires spreading through compartments never meant to burn, the vessel remained afloat. Engines still turned, guns still fired. To those watching from a distance, it may have looked like resilience. To those inside, it felt like time slowing down. Each minute stretched unnaturally long. Every explosion carried the question, is this the one? Each report from below decks was weighed carefully, hoping for the word contained, dreading the word uncontrolled. And yet, beneath it all, something more dangerous was happening. Fuel was leaking. Fires were spreading through confined spaces. Air circulation systems were failing. The ship had survived the initial blows, but survival was now creating its own danger. What followed would not come from a single decisive hit. It would come from accumulation.
The fires were supposed to be temporary, localized, contained, controlled by procedure and discipline. That was the assumption damage control teams operated under as they moved through smoke-filled passageways, sealing bulkheads, dragging hoses, and forcing their way into compartments where visibility dropped to nothing. But this fire behaved differently. Fuel vapors had spread invisibly through sections of the ship long before anyone realized it. Ventilation systems, designed to keep crews alive in battle, had carried danger instead, feeding heat and fumes into spaces far from the original impact. What should have burned out began to grow. Below decks, temperatures climbed rapidly. Men worked stripped down to the waist, sweat mixing with oil and soot, breathing through cloth soaked in water that did little to filter the air. Communication became fragmented, telephones failed, runners were sent, only to turn back when heat made passage impossible. Some compartments were simply abandoned, not by choice, but because entering them meant not coming back out. On the bridge, the situation grew harder to read. Reports conflicted. One moment damage seemed manageable, the next another fire flared somewhere deeper in the ship. The hull still held, the engines still responded. From the outside, nothing suggested collapse. That illusion was dangerous. Inside, the ship was becoming a closed system under stress, heat rising, air thinning, pressure building in spaces never meant to contain it. Ammunition magazines sat uncomfortably close to fires that no longer respected boundaries. Officers knew the risk. They had studied it, trained for it, but training assumed time to flood compartments, to vent spaces, to cool steel gradually. What they had now was minutes. The order came to prepare for the worst. Not spoken openly, not broadcast loudly, just subtle changes. Crews quietly repositioned, evacuation routes reconsidered, life jackets distributed without explanation. No one used the word abandon. Saying it too early could create panic. Saying it too late could make it meaningless. Then the ship lurched. Not from an external impact, but from within. A dull, rising force rippled through the structure, throwing men off balance, snapping lights, extinguishing some fires while igniting others. Bulkheads bowed. Steel screamed under stress it was never designed to endure. This was no longer damage. This was failure. The bridge understood it immediately. The ship was losing the fight against itself. Orders came faster now, conflicting at times, corrected almost as soon as they were given. The priority shifted not to saving the vessel, but to saving whoever could still be saved. Some men made it topside. Others never had the chance. Smoke filled stairwells, passageways collapsed, compartments became traps within seconds. In places, the heat alone was lethal before flames ever reached flesh. And still, the ship did not sink. It lingered, burning, breaking, carrying its crew toward a final moment that everyone could now sense, but no one could predict precisely.
because when ships like this die, they rarely do so quietly.
The explosion did not give warning. There was no gradual buildup, no final command shouted across the deck, just a sudden, overwhelming force, violent enough to erase sound itself for an instant. A pressure wave tore through the ship from the inside out, snapping steel, lifting sections of deck as if they weighed nothing. Those who survived the blast would later struggle to describe it. Some said it felt like the ship had been struck by the sea itself. Others said it was as if the world had simply ended, then restarted in fire. Flames burst upward, smoke rolled skyward in a towering column visible for miles. Debris, metal, wood, fragments of equipment rained back down into the water. The ship that had continued forward despite every warning was now unrecognizable. In seconds, the illusion of control vanished. Men were thrown into the sea without knowing how they got there. Others were trapped as sections of the ship collapsed inward. Fires that had once been fought spread freely now, fed by exposed fuel and ruptured compartments. The ship began to list sharply. Water rushed in where steel had been torn open. What remained of internal order dissolved into instinct, climbing, jumping, running toward open air while it still existed. Officers tried to organize evacuation where possible, but chaos moved faster than commands. Some sailors leapt into the ocean, choosing the unknown below over the certainty of fire above. Others stayed, not because they wanted to, but because there was nowhere left to go. As the ship rolled, its size worked against it. Weight shifted, compartments flooded unevenly. The structure groaned one final time, then gave way. When it finally sank, it did not slip beneath the surface gently. It went down violently, dragging air, debris, and men with it, leaving behind a spreading slick of oil, floating wreckage, and silence broken only by fire crackling on the water. Those who survived clung to whatever they could find: rafts, planks, pieces of the ship that had carried them into battle and then into disaster. Hours later, rescue would come for some. For many, it would not. And in the aftermath, investigators would piece together what had happened, not as a mystery, but as a chain of decisions, each one understandable on its own, each one narrowing the path until only one outcome remained. They had time to turn back, not just once, but repeatedly. And yet the ship kept sailing. Because in the final stages of the war, momentum mattered more than caution, orders mattered more than conditions, and retreat, no matter how logical, was often seen as the greater danger. This was not a story of incompetence. It was a story of systems, expectations, and a doctrine that continued moving forward long after the world had changed around it. If you want more stories like this, where a single decision echoes through history, subscribe to the channel and stay with us. These moments didn't just decide battles, they decided lives, and they're worth remembering.